Welcome to JLive. I'm Laura Mandel, JArts Executive Director, and it's great to be with you for JLive, our JArts virtual series of bite-sized conversations about Jewish life and art with the best Boston artists with Boston connections. Today, I'm with artist, photographer, and Framingham State University art professor, Leslie Starobin. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor of having me and the wonderful introduction. As you know, or as you didn't know, I love Leonard Cohen and I often listen to him in my studio. So it's very appropriate.
I love it. We aim to please, and we also love Leonard Cohen here at JArts. So, of course, during our conversation, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many of them as time allows. So, Leslie, when we've been talking about your work for a couple of years now, but I love how you think about it as this journey through these stories. So I want you to sort of take us on this journey. And I would love to start with a body of work that you call The Last Address, which is a body of work that tells so much of who you are as an artist. It's really about illuminating history through photos and objects. So let's talk about The Last Address and let's look through a couple pieces in it to sort of start to understand who you are.
Sure, thank you. Well, The Last Address started because many years ago, right before my grandmother passed away, she gave me a box of keepsakes that were my grandfather's. And there were a number of old photographs from Eastern Europe in it of his parents, my great-grandparents and aunts and uncles. And there was also an address there. It was part of an envelope. The envelope was postmarked, of all places, Kiev, the Ukraine, which we're all thinking about right now. And it was addressed to Simcha Rosenblatt, my grandfather's brother, in Malden, Massachusetts. And she said, it's the last address that we have, you can't throw it away. And that stayed with me, as you can imagine. And many years later, I made a montage similar to the piece here. I mean, it was with her objects, and it kind of started me on this journey. And I would ask people, you know, what did you inherit from your mother or your grandmother? Or in the case of this woman, what did you bring with you when she came from Iran? It's called the Iranian passport photo. And I interviewed the people extensively, and she came to our meeting with her passport photo, which you see here. And, you know, she's covered as she had to after the Islamic Revolution started in 1979. And that's her passport photo. And she brought, of all things, a Megillah Esther, or Scroll of Esther, you know, which is the scroll that Jews read on the Purim holiday, which basically tells the story of the Jews escaping annihilation in antiquity, you know, in Persia. So it was incredibly appropriate. And you're not allowed to bring religious items out of Iran when she was leaving. So she had it lined, or she smuggled it out of the country and it was put in the lining of a baby carriage. So
wow. Wow, that's a pretty incredible story. Shall we look at the next image?
Sure. So this image is a little bit different. I just want to say that all the objects, the tray in the previous one, here the material, come from the family. I don't run out to Joanne Fabric and buy some material that I think would look good with this bolero. It's the vest that this bride wore for her henna celebration. But that was part of her wedding dress. But I also use whatever identification documents I can find. So in the corner here, you can read, my French is not going to be right, but Maggie and Max, and the date of their wedding, January 21st, 1953. And you know where it is because on the back of Maggie's photograph, I found the logo of the wedding photographer. And the photographers, especially when they were photographing like joyous events, were almost always the members of the Jewish community in these various countries. And I wanted to commemorate the photographers because without them, we wouldn't have pictures. And also in many cases, they may not have known it, but they were recording the last generation of people to be married in a particular place. And Maggie, who's no longer alive, but she ultimately came to Boston, but she had 3 migrations. She went from Tunis to Paris. She told me that her husband said when the French leave, we leave. And they went to Paris with this, where their family was. And later on, she, many years later, she came to Boston because her daughter had married an American and settled here. And she brought 4 generations of Tunisian Jewish bridal trousseau or artifacts to the United States.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. You're like a historian through art. This is really incredible. Let's look at the next.
This is a family that went in the 19th century from Europe, specifically Germany, to what became later on South Africa. And I taught history of photography for years. So I always look through and like, there's this wonderful photograph here in the bottom. It's a tintype. For those of you who don't know, a tintype is a one-of-a-kind image on metal. It was actually very popular in the United States during the Civil War because it's on tin. It doesn't bend, it's portable, you can send it places. And again, the identification document comes from the photographer's frame, the Transvaal, 1897. And I noticed in the picture on the top, which is the same group of German Jewish immigrants with Africans that you see up here, it says Bella 1893. So Bella is the name of one of the women here. And she was writing on the back of the photograph. So whenever there's something on the back, and sometimes it's a whole letter, I try to integrate it into the composition.
I think it's incredible how you're taking us across the world through global Jewry here. And this one really intrigues me because I think very few people know about the Jewish community in Shanghai. So tell us about this piece.
So yes, there were actually 2 Jewish communities in Shanghai. This piece doesn't represent that. There were many Sephardic Jews. I had a friend in graduate school whose grandfather was the rabbi in Shanghai, and his family had originally gone from Iraq to Bombay, India, and then to Shanghai. But in this case, this family went from Berlin to Shanghai in 1939. It was the last port of entry open to Jews fleeing, Europe. And this couple had been married, I think, about a year before Kristallnacht. And on Kristallnacht, the groom and his father-in-law, the bride's father, were arrested by the Germans. And the bride's father ended up in Dachau. It was a prison at that time, not a concentration camp. And when he was released, he was told, you are released as long as you leave this country immediately. So he and his wife and his daughter and her husband left. And Helmut, the groom here, he brought about 100 books. And as Helmut's son, Henry, who was a colleague of mine at Framingham State, he's since retired, told me, who flees a country with 100 books? Well, he found out that his father was bringing American dollar bills, which were quite valuable at the time, smuggling in the books and gluing the page, smuggling between pages of the book and gluing them in there. And the glue, still was, he could see it 50, 60 years later. And in China, Helmut actually had a little push cart, and he would go through the neighborhoods where there were German refugees, and for a tiny amount of money, renting out the books to people. But I'll just say one other thing. When he went to, when they went to from Berlin to Shanghai, he brought a teacup that his parents had engraved for him on his first birthday in 1911. And you also see here the J, which was a stamp from the Nazi Jew, the Nazis put on Jewish passports. You see some Chinese writing here and some other things. So that was really an amazing story, and they had a lot of material that ultimately came to the United States in the late 40s when they were able to immigrate here.
Wow. And I should note that there are many, many more pieces in this collection that we are not looking at today. But Leslie, I just think it's incredible, like I said, how you've taken us across the world through these Jewish stories and journeys. It's pretty powerful. So now I want to take us to a totally different place, your own living room, which is, I see this piece behind you. And I know the instant we got on Zoom, I said, tell me about that. What is that? Because I'm so taken by it. And you told me that that's a piece that you made back in about 2002. And it's actually called The Shop Windows of History, because as you can see on the screen, it was inspired by the title of a poem by great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. So we'll leave it all to you to read this really powerful quote. But Leslie, go ahead and tell us about this piece that's behind you. And we'll, of course, give you a zoom in so you can all see it up close as well. But tell us about this.
So in the year 2000, I had a sabbatical. Every college professor loves a sabbatical. And I went to Moscow because I have a brother, Paul, who's a journalist, and he was stationed in Moscow for about 5 years. And so obviously I wanted to come. And when I was there, we also went to Belarus, to the town of our last name, Starobin or Starobin. It's actually very close to the Ukrainian border. And we did a story there. But when I was in Moscow, I went to a park, which is, I think, informally called the Park of Falling Idols. It has another name. And I think you see this bust of Lenin on the left side, the right side of the canvas, excuse me. And that was one place that I photographed. And while I was in Moscow, my husband took our 2 very young children to Tel Aviv, where his parents lived. They're Holocaust survivors, and they met in Tel Aviv in 1947. And we spent a couple of weeks there. And when I was in Moscow, I was able to buy some I think they were audio. I don't remember if they were DVDs or with CDs at that time, but it was popular Russian ballads from the 1940s. And I brought them from my father-in-law because he escaped from Poland to the Soviet Union in 1939 when the Germans occupied Poland, and he spent a couple of years in Russia felling trees, and he loved the music. He started singing all the songs, and it also inspired him and my mother-in-law to tell even more stories about the war, which I had already been collecting for a number of years. And so this piece really was inspired by the trip. On the left side, we see some sculptures from antiquity from Rome that were in the sculpture garden in the Israel Museum. So kind of encapsulated my trip, and started another project, which I really didn't do for another 20 years. And so the next project, basically what happened was, I had been collecting my in-laws' stories, and my mother-in-law Tola and my father-in-law Meir, and my mother-in-law's, one of her sisters, Dorka, who had lived across the street from her in Tel Aviv, loved to talk and had a phenomenal memory. And I started to record them all the time. Whenever we visited, Dorka would want to tell me another story, and I brought an audio recorder, and I kept that material. And in the year 2019, my husband decided that his parents had never wanted to return to Poland, but he wanted to go to they're from the same hometown, but they met in Israel, and his aunt Dorka was still alive. So we had the opportunity to plan the trip with her. She was too old to be able to travel with us, but she came virtually, and then we went from Poland to Israel so we could show her all of the material. And wow. I photographed in Poland, and my son is now grown up and a filmmaker, and my daughter's a painter. They brought their art supplies, they brought the film camera, and I photographed, not knowing that I was going to pair the photographs up with the text that I had been collecting for something like 25 years.
Wow. So I know we have a couple images of this. So let's move forward on the slides and see what we have here, because I'm eager to see these. So tell us about this image.
So this is my mother-in-law late in life, obviously, with the story that her younger sister, as I said, Dorka, she had 2 sisters, Dorka and Hannah, told me maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I asked them, just my mother-in-law and her 2 sisters returned to Łódź, which is Łódź in Polish, their hometown. After liberation, they were in the Łódź ghetto, in Auschwitz, and a Czech work camp. And they came back after their parents perished in Auschwitz, and they weren't able to get into their home. They moved into some lodging, and my mother-in-law was very fair, and her 2 sisters were very dark. So my mother-in-law would put on a kerchief, look like a Polish woman, go to the bakery, buy baked goods every morning. And one day the women in front of her were talking in Polish and saying the Jews are just like rats. They jump, they come back, out of the sewer, they're back, but they're going to disappear again. And my mother-in-law returned to her lodging, and the sisters decided that there was no future for them in Poland. and they joined one of those, what's called the bricha in Hebrew, escapes, those illegal journeys across Europe to the Mediterranean, where they boarded, ferries to what was mandatory Palestine at the time. Not the Exodus, they came before then. And the rest basically, I guess, is history. And then in 2019, I guess if we looked at the next picture, the cemetery, when we went to Poland, there were specific places that we wanted to go based on stories my in-laws had told their children and Dorka had told us. And Dorka had also written a diary in 1945 in July, the same time period as the bakery story after the war. And it's in an archive in Warsaw, the Jewish Historical Institute. She signed her name, her Polish name, Dworzha. And we were able to see it. I have a copy of it, a PDF, which I had translated into English. And I didn't know then that I was going to use this text in this manner, but I realized that I started to think about this as like a large book. These pieces are 24 by 28 inches. So when you see the photograph, it's almost like you can step into the place, and you can also read the text. So it's titled A Tomb from 1900 because there's some beautiful, destroyed, but beautiful tombs in this cemetery. It was once the largest Jewish cemetery in Europe. And in 1900, Łódź was a textile town, and they clothed most of Eastern Europe. And some of the factory owners were Jews, some were Germans, some were Poles, and some were Russians, actually. It's a very multicultural city at that time. And clearly this is a factory owner, had a tomb built for his family. And when I added the text from Dorka, from her diary, she's talking about the hunger in the ghetto. And they were in the ghetto for close to 4.5 years. And she's talking about how whole families died from hunger, and daily the cemetery grew bigger. So I thought of this, here's 2 different time periods. And then we have the present time, June 2019, when I clicked the shutter and made the picture. And it alludes to the state the cemetery's in. And I think the next image also has these huge tombs that have fallen over. And years ago, I recorded Dorka telling me that they hid in the cemetery when the ghetto was being liquidated in August 1944. It was the longest lasting Nazi ghetto, and in part because the Germans put the textile workers of the city to work, making clothing and other things for the German war machine. So she said there were very high tombstones there. We can see it now, but the cemetery was significant to us because they tried to hide from the Germans at the very end in August 1944 in the cemetery. Not to mention also that my husband has relatives that are buried there from before the war. People who died during the ghetto are basically in unmarked graves. So as you can imagine, they couldn't hide from the Germans here. At some point they realized that. They didn't know where they were going, so they decided to report to the transport. And so we went from the cemetery, as they did, to the Radagast train station, which I believe is in the next image. And the Radagast train station, there are a couple authentic cattle cars at the train station today. And there's a memorial to the Jews and the Romas who were also in the Łódź ghetto, who were deported to a number of different concentration camps, but to Auschwitz in August 1944. And the story that, we went inside the car and we were talking about, a story that my mother-in-law, both Dorka and my mother-in-law spoke about it, but my mother-in-law always talked about what it was like to be in the car itself. And I chose to use that text as a result. And I can read it, or we can go to the next one. That's fine. We can, so as you can imagine, I think you know where they went. And we went from Poland to Israel. And so, of course, my husband had also been taking pictures on his iPhone. So we'd have a quick slideshow to be able to show Dorka when we got there. And she saw this image And I ultimately, because of what she said, paired it with her diary entry when she talks about barbed wires, as far as you can see, wires and barracks and nothing else. And here you see the barracks, they're ruined now. But she also started to talk about, for hours, and my son filmed her, what it was like to arrive at Auschwitz with stories that she's in her 90s. She had never told her children or my husband, his brother, or me. And so we recorded that. And it was 24 hours from the moment they arrived at Auschwitz to the three women, I mean, the four women, the three sisters and their mother ended up in the barrack, you know, without food. And as Dorcas said, you can go without food, but you can't go without water. And they marched all night long. So that was very profound.
Wow, Leslie, it's just a really powerful story. And I think you have an incredible way of bringing these stories to life and paying homage to these people through your work. I mean, I think, you know, we all know the power of an image, but your combination of the text and the images in your storytelling, I think, is really doing something special that we all need to be doing more of. So I just want to say thank you for this work. And let's, because we're just about at time, tell us about this photo and then we'll wrap up.
So this was a story. And again, this is an image I think that we all know, and I almost didn't include it in the collection, but I started to think about it. And the more I looked at the shoes, you know, the file on my computer, I started to think about every one of those shoes represents a human being with an individual story, and they walk down that road now. You know, I had a very graphic description from Dorca. Also relates to a story that my mother-in-law always told her son, that she arrived at her two sons. And then my husband would tell our children, you know, my mother arrived in Auschwitz with a diamond in her shoe. Well, that wasn't exactly how the story went, according to Dorca. But they did hide the last jewel they had after 4.5 years in the ghetto, hoping maybe they didn't know where they were going. Maybe they would be able to use it to bribe, you know, a guard to get some more food or save another person's life. And of course, that was impossible, you know, as they discovered. And so that was a way to kind of bring these, something that we look at and we say, oh, we've seen it so many times, but yet there is a personal story behind every one of these shoes.
Well, and I just want to say, Leslie, thank you, because as you noted, this story behind each of those shoes, it's like your work is illuminating these stories behind all of these people who we should be knowing about. So thank you so much for illuminating this for us. Thank you for being here today. I wish we had a little more time to go through more of these, but I just want to say thank you. And for all of you out there, if you've enjoyed what you've seen today, you can see how important conversations like this are. Please know that these do not exist without generous community support from people like you. So please consider making a donation to JArts to continue these important conversations. And Leslie, thank you so much. To be continued.
Yes, thank you for all your hard work. Oh, it's one of my students here. Oh.
And you have many fans out there. So I just want to say thank you again so much. Less questions and more just comments about how wonderful this has been. So to be continued. Thanks so much, Leslie. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.